So I think we are going to start. So if you can find your seats, and we will start. So we did, unfortunately, lose 2 Sundays. So now I am going to try to cram 4 weeks into 2. So I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'm going to try. So I might glaze over a few points a little bit quick so to try to fit it in. So I'm sorry, but we are going to try to see if we can get this in here. So as I said, this is going to be your fun fact for today. And the beginning is that there's actually an interesting thing about that. Christianity is actually the genesis of the emancipation movement. A lot of people don't know that because, especially in America, secularists like to steal that and say this is ours, when in reality it's not. So, so first off, here is the first abolitionist everywhere, Gregory of Nyssa. It's a fun name. And he was born in 335. So, very early on, he was a Christian abolitionist. And here's his commentary on Ecclesiastes, where he talks about how you shouldn't enslave people. So that's kind of fun, is like, we go back to even like, shortly after Christ, we have these abolitionists. And the irony is that his opponents that were against him were also Christians, but their reasoning why that slavery should still exist as long as it was regulated under what the Bible taught was that is a great way of feeding the poor, right? So they never thought that, like, what we ended up in the South, should have come about and happened. So here's a lot of dates, lots of fun stuff. I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but here's just a bunch of, things where, like, Christians, from as early on as Constantine, where he gave priests the ability to free slaves. Monument is actually a fun word. It means they become free, and they also become citizens, which is kind of a big deal. So you have that from Constantine all the way down to Isabella of Spain, where they banned slavery in Spain and banned enslaving the Indian population, unless if they were cannibals or hostiles. So that is the one exception. They're like, well, if you're that bad, then, well, that's the problem. But speaking of the New World, a lot of people wonder why you have all these rules and regulations about, especially coming from, the Christian organizations. How did we end up in the New World where these people were basically like heavy slavery? And it is because of, I like this guy because he calls infidels, right? The infidel philosophers. But he argues that this James Ramsey, who actually was alive at the time, he argued that the Enlightenment period caused basically an increase in atheism and lack of Christianity from these infidel philosophers, and that they, like Hume and Voltaire, and then that caused this increase in irreligiosity, increased slavery and abuses in the New World. And he was right about both Hume. Hume says not very nice things about how you can totally enslave Africans, and so did Voltaire. So gotta love the Enlightenment, right? So continuing on with this, past the Age of Enlightenment into the Age of Discovery, you actually have a lot more of stuff where, like, a lot of people don't know this, but Quakers were abused in the New World because they were actually persecuted because they had this idea of, we should preach and try to convert the slaves, right? And then a lot of these plantation owners were like, no, we don't want you doing that, because then if they do that, they're going to say, we have rights, you can't be abusing us in this way. And so they actually persecuted the Quakers because they were like, oh, hey, yeah, you should preach to your slaves. And that's actually very common, even in the South that happened, where there was preachers who tried to convert slaves, and they would be run out of town or sometimes even killed because of that. But during the Age of Discovery, you have that where you have basically these Christians trying to work at both converting the slaves, but also trying to get them more rights. Often, a lot of people think that the Catholic priests in the New World were just as abusive as their other the Spanish or other things. But they often would actually fight for the rights of the native populations and build schools, hospitals, and other such things to try to help the native population to do that. And then finally, when we get to the first actual abolitionism, we hit Britain, because they were actually one of the first European nations, especially with how far-reaching they were, actually abolished slavery. So you have other places like Sweden, Holland, they abolished slave trade, but what that means is that you couldn't trade slaves, but you could still, have internal slavery. But Britain was the first one to kind of do that, and they actually captured slave ships of other countries and released the slaves because they were just awesome like that. But this was kind of spearheaded by basically a man named William Wilberforce. He actually finally got abolishment passed. And if you want to read a really good book,
Amazing Grace.
Thank you, Jess. Amazing Grace by, who was? Eric Metaxas. I could not remember that. It's a great book. He also has a great book on Bonhoeffer. You should probably read those. But, that's slave trade in Britain is abolished. They abolish it in their colonies and the like. And then after they abolish slavery in Britain, they go, we should do this in the rest of Europe. So these Quakers and Methodists and Anglicans start spreading out, and they start going to other countries, and then they eventually get it through most of Europe where they abolish slave trade. And then they look and they're like, we really got to fix America. Because, of course, we were kind of the problematic child on the front. And so the Quakers and the Baptists and the Methodists in America, got fired up because Britain abolished slavery. So they started working here, and then also British people came here and tried to work on abolishing slavery. Fun fact: we often like to think that, the South was very religious at the time before the Civil War, and they really weren't. They average from church attendance and church attendance numbers that maybe only about 17% of America as a whole was going to church, and it was actually less in the South where there's 13%. Then you have the Second Great Awakening, and that jumps up to 37%, and correlation with that is also, after the Second Great Awakening, abolitionism becomes a populist movement, right? You have a lot of people who want abolition, and then you have a lot of people working towards it, but they can never get enough political clout to basically push it through. So finally they start working with the secularists, and with that kind of amalgamation, you get kind of what happens where they finally, and then, you have the Civil War eventually, but they had to kind of work with them to get that. So kind of fun thing that Christianity works to abolish slavery, and even to this day, it is one of the biggest forces to abolish slavery because there's still slavery in the world. But this is kind of just a fun European-American type of thing. So that's the fun fact. I'm sorry I'm going fast, but we got a lot to cover. So we're talking about genocide. A very Christmassy topic. I know everyone talks about genocide at this time of year. Herod did kill all those babies, right? I love medieval artwork because they take biblical stories and then they just kind of put on a medieval type. They did not wear armor like this when they conquest of Canaan. This is supposed to be Jericho because you have the trumpeters and the Ark of the Covenant. I like how the Ark of the Covenant is just like a little church. But sorry, I just love medieval artwork because I find it so funny. So we're talking about genocide in the Old Testament. It's often something a lot of people like to point to when they talk about, is God a vindictive bully in dealing stuff with that. So I want to kind of, go through this and talk through this and kind of tell you, I'll tell you my opinions when we get there. But we have a few disclaimers first. Because whenever you do this, and I was going to talk about these more, so we're going to boil these down real quick. I'm sorry if I'm talking fast, because I can hear myself. I'm like, wow, I'm going real fast. So, first disclaimer. We are dispensational and not covenantalist, right? That's supposed to be history, not Old Testament. Old Testament history is for Israel and not the church today, okay? There are parts of the Old Testament that still do apply today. But it's kind of this... the problem with this is that covenantalists right? We have family members who are covenantalists. We have friends who are. They're wonderful people, but there's just problem of where they try to apply Old Testament things to this day. And so if you don't know this, the Presbyterian Church is trying to, the conservative Presbyterian Church is doing this thing where they're trying to take back over from the liberal Presbyterian Church, because the liberals have kind of taken over and subsumed a lot of their stuff. So they're trying to do this thing, and a lot of times they use the arguments of like Joshua and stuff like that as they take over the land and take it back from the heretics. And I'm like, what do you do about the killing of everyone, right? Like, you're not supposed to kill the liberal people. And so, like, that's always and they would never argue that, but they're using, like, the conquest of Canaan as a justification for, taking over, taking back these historically Presbyterian areas, right? So I just want to make that point, because while these things are, they talked about this, we do not believe that still applies today. Of course, because that's, I think, the biblical approach. This is a time in history. This should not be used for such things. And that's also what the Crusades did. They said, God said, take the Holy Land, so we're still going to do it to this day. We're going to take the Holy Land and kill everyone. That did not, of course, go well. So my second disclaimer is genre matters. I was going to do this whole thing talking about polemics and stuff like that, but in the Psalms, polemic language is used a lot, right? And that means basically polemic language is you use a very violent description to kind of get your point across, right? So, it does say, blessed are the people who dashed the Babylonian children on the rocks, right? And it's because it's kind of a way, that for the Hebrews to remember what the Babylonians did to them, because this is what they did. They would take babies and smash them on the rocks. So it's a way of, remembering that. But it's also kind of calling down judgment on Babylonia. I can't say that, apparently. The place, because they did that to the Israelites, and of course the Babylonians were very, very evil people, right? Cool? Good with this disclaimer? Polemic language. So we're not going to talk about any form of genocide or smashing of babies in the Psalms. So, okay, this one is also for Meg Madden. Kind of talking about, I was wrong, I did actually have something on it. But we're talking about the age of accountability, right? And kind of talking about if children are killed in such ways, they are actually, I think it's a biblical thing that babies that die go to heaven. Of course, you have 2 Samuel where, David says, I will go to him, but he will not return to me, right? Talking about his dead child. But you also have, I find very interesting, as you go through the Bible, there's very, very few groups of people that are called innocent, right? But consistently throughout the Bible, children and babies are that group called innocent, right? And I think that's where we get kind of the idea of the age of accountability, right? And so that's where you kind of get that idea of, if they're innocent, are they judged, right? And so that's where you kind of get that logical argument of where you get the age of accountability. So here's just a few of them. There's actually a lot of times where in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, they're called innocent, like they're an innocent group. So that's always fun. And actually, what I like about this is in this Jeremiah verse right here, it actually condemns abortion. A lot of people don't know this. But fun fact too, we're having more fun facts. In Jeremiah, it talks about the innocence of these children that are basically the children of prostitutes. That's what this wicked woman here is, right there, wicked woman. And they were murdered. And so it says the skirts, on their skirts is found the lifeblood of the innocent poor, right? What's talking about is babies that are being aborted. A lot of people don't know that. And a lot of people, when they try to argue for abortion, it's a value ethic kind of idea, which works really well. I mean, I think that's a great way of arguing it. But this is another thing where it talks about, you should not kill children. So that's a fun thing. Okay, and then finally, we have the big question of all, which I think a lot of especially atheists, they always like to point to this. They always ask, how can a loving God judge people, right? You also have the same question when you deal with hell. Like, how can a loving God send people to hell? And unfortunately, this is kind of a problem that we've, I think, kind of brought upon ourselves, because in like the past kind of, I don't know, since the Civil War, we've been really, what I say, focusing on the love of God and not really talking about his other attributes, right? I mean, like, you can go to a lot of churches and they're like, hyper-focused on the love of God, but they also don't like to talk about how God is just, right? And that he is also righteous, right? So if you take those two things out, that question makes sense. But when you add in God's other attributes, God is just, and in the sense of like there needs to be payment for sins, right? And so if you don't have that, then everyone should go to hell, right? Because we've all sinned, right? And we should all go to hell. But of course, God is righteous, so he pays the payment through himself, but you have to accept that, right? I know, basic gospel message. Fun stuff. But I always find this question a little bit disingenuous, because it's always like, we just hyper-focus on the love of God and we kind of forget, like, God is also just, right? So that's why he judges people and also sends people to hell, right? So I got a meme for you. And while I talk, I'm going to kind of jabber a bit. Now we're going to start talking about the actual, talking about genocide in the Old Testament. And I am going to be honest, I really struggle with this question, because I've dealt with a few atheists before when talking about this question, and I feel like they always talk out of both sides of their mouth. They're like, how could God not deal with evil in the world? And then when God proceeds to deal with evil in the world, it's like, how could God judge people? Like, that's a contradictory statement. That's dealing, these types of things in the, when God floods the world, right? He's dealing with the evil in the world, right? And so that's why, I don't know, I find it. But when it comes to Christians struggling with this question, I think I've kind of boiled it down to 3 questions, right? So if you have a Christian struggling with, like the flood or the conquest of Canaan and things like that, I think I got 3 questions that you kind of need to think through in order to be able to, something to kind of work with. So here are my 3 questions for you. Does God have the right to judge people, right? Often when we get kind of antsy about these types of things where, God judging people, we like to remove the fact that, or we like to, not think of God in the sense of what I was saying before in the loving, but, remove his right to judge, right? And then you have to ask the question is, does God have the right to judge cultures, right? Because we often like to say, well, culture is kind of this weird thing in which things happen, right? And because most of these things, like if you look at Canaan, their cultural practice was sacrificing children, right? That was, every Tuesday you'd go out, you throw your baby on the Moloch, and, that's how it worked, right? And so with that kind of idea, you have to say, yes, God has the right to judge cultures, and he has the right to judge people. And then you have to ask the final question, does God have the right to enact his judgments with violence, right? That's where people get the hang up right here, is this violence part where they don't get. But his judgments are not like, he snaps his finger and all the bad people disappear, right? He uses things like the flood or his covenant people to enact his judgments, or in Revelation, himself coming down and wiping out all the people like that. So these are kind of 4 questions. If you have a Christian friend who's struggling with these types of things, this is what I would like to ask and kind of go through this slowly with them. But any questions, thoughts, ideas, comments? Yes?
Who decides whether God has the right or not?
God.
Right.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so this is just trying to get them to focus back on that idea. God has the right to do these things, right? And I know we get a little antsy about it because we don't like the idea of, God judging people. But I think you have to kind of go back to the fact that God has this right and moral obligation to do so, right? Because of his goodness and his righteousness, right? So, yes. Mr. Tompkins.
Another thing I bring up to people when they talk about God, why he does that, is I bring out the attribute of his holiness. In our culture, it doesn't realize,
Oh, yeah.
not grasp the holiness of God.
Yeah, his holiness is such an important aspect because he can't tolerate sin, right? You know, there can't be sin in heaven, right? Because God's holiness is there. If there is, then that person would be eradicated, right? Not in the, but yeah. So now we're going to talk about the genocide in the Old Testament. So we're going to first start off with the conquest of Canaan. And I have a question for you, okay? You ready for this? This is a really deep question. Does utterly destroyed mean utterly destroyed? And so before you send me back to first grade reading comprehension, let me explain my point, because this is, I know, kind of a silly question. But I want to point out a few things. And this is kind of a thing that people struggle with in the Old Testament. So here we have Hebron. Hebron? I think that's how you say it. And you have Josiah, and he utterly destroyed it. And every person who was in it, right? Hebron's in this list somewhere. Where are you? There it is. Hebron. It's right there. Okay? Right? He utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it. Okay? And then we go to Judges, and we get, so Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Right? So, right? When I say utterly, what does utterly destroyed mean? Utterly destroyed? You have this here, and then later on, they do it like they're facing against them, right? Or let's take the Amalekites. I don't know why that didn't pop up first. Okay, Amalekites. Everyone knows this, right? 1 Samuel. God says, I'll punish the Amalekites for what they did in Israel. Go strike the Amalekites, completely destroy everything that he has. Do not spare, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Okay? Pretty, utterly destroyed. Kill everything, right? So then you have that in 1 Samuel. And then later in 1 Samuel in 27, David and his men face against the Amalekites, right? And actually the Amalekites are kidnapped two of David's wives. And they had David's wives. And they had to go and reclaim them, right? So that's another thing, right? But it's even more than that. If you go to Esther, Haman is a son of Agag, is an Agagite, which means he's a descendant from Agag, which is the king that Solomon slew to pieces. I love that verse. And Solomon hacked him to pieces, right? So you have descendants, right, from the king who died, and the Amalekites later pop up in the story, right, where David has to deal with them. So what's happening here? And here's another one for you. You shall utterly destroy them, but don't marry them, right? This is in the same thing, right? So how do you deal with this, right? And so some people will say, this is kind of, some people will say, well, there's two options, right? It's either a contradiction or we are interpreting it incorrectly, right? And I will argue it's the latter, of course, because I don't believe the Bible has contradictions. But so we're going to kind of go through that. I'm going to take it a bit slower because this is kind of a hard thing to deal with. So this utterly destroyed word is haram. I think I said that right. So that's this word here. It appears a lot: to ban, devote, destroy utterly, completely destroy, and here's a bunch of uses of it, right? So that's what the word there is. So there is three kind of explanations. I am struggling to speak today. I'm sorry. Explanations for what this means. Out of the three of them, there's one I don't like and two I think are correct. So we'll go with the first one, the one I don't like, and that is this idea of war language. And when you go into any discussion, this is the default response. Oh, it's war language, right? And so what it is in ancient times and in every culture around the time, you have people saying, I utterly destroyed this people group. Here is Merheptah. He was a pharaoh, and he says, Israel is waste, its seed is not, right? And then there's also a bunch of other people here that still existed after this. This is very common in the regions of the area around Israel where they would say, like, I totally, annihilated these people. And then they're like, but Dave's from there and he's still there, right? So it's very common. And they're using it more in the sense of complete, or like a overwhelming victory, right? They had an overwhelming victory over these people. You utterly destroyed them, right? Blah, 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 that type of stuff there. This is the one I don't like because this relies on looking at other cultures and saying, well, this is similar to what other cultures do. And I don't tend to have to look to interpret the Bible. You have to look at other cultures to understand things. So I'm going to go into the other two explanations, which I do like. So we'll talk about those. And so the first one is when they say they utterly destroyed a city, we have to ask, what is a city, right? Because cities back in the ancient time were very different than what we do today. So like if I say city, you all think probably Springfield, I don't know, other cities around us, Chicago, New York, Boston, I don't know, places like that, right? Where a city is everyone who lives in a defined group or defined area, right, that is called we have the city limits. Well, back in the ancient times, you have to remember that these were very agrarian cultures, right? So you would have about maybe 90% of your people were farmers, and they often lived near their farmland, right? So when you have a city, right, here's a city. This is Tel Megiddo, right? I picked this one specifically because it had a cool picture, and the math is easy. So Tel Megiddo is 125 acres in total, right? This whole city, right? And also Joshua 12:21 says he utterly destroyed the city, right? So this is 125 acres, right? And if you want a reference, Southwind Park is 80 acres. So it's about 1.5 times the size of Southwind Park. Mr. Henry's here, so I had to throw the about because it's not exact. So if you say I destroyed a city, and this was common things back in the day, you would have a lot of people living on the peripheral, right? Your farmers and stuff like that. And if your army marched up in the city, you would do one of two things. Your people on the peripheral would come into the city and be there, and that's why whenever there's war, there's often plagues associated with it, because you have a very small area packed with people, right? Or they would run away, right? So your people in the fields would run and just kind of run to the countryside or try to get away from the army. So if you think about it, if you utterly destroyed a city, right, what do you have in here? You have the city. Basically, you'd have your temples. You'd have the political leaders' places, like the king would live there, the people that are associated with the king and stuff like that. And the warriors, especially the really good ones that you'd keep. This one actually has stables somewhere. They're just stables. The palace, And you would also have basically the priests of your religion, right? Which is what God is condemning these people for what they're doing. So if you marched up on a city and you utterly destroyed it, right? You killed the king and everyone inside. Most of the time, also prostitutes were in here. So that would be the women that would be in there. So that's what would happen with that, right? So that's one explanation. Good? Everyone understand? Okay, cool. And now the second explanation, we're going to go to the modern times. So this is also what we say. When we talk about the Nazis, we say the Allies utterly destroyed them, right? Did we kill every single Nazi that was in existence, right? But we destroyed their power, we destroyed their culture, we destroyed their belief systems, right? That's what often we do. I mean, there's still Nazis to this day, unfortunately. But that's what we talk about, is when we say we utterly destroyed. So what's happening here is they would march against these people, and they utterly destroyed their culture, their religion, their practices, and often their kings and their high priests and whatever, well, all their priests normally. And so that's what we're talking about here when we mean, so we're not talking about your everyday person, right, in that sense, is we talk about their culture was utterly destroyed, right? And so this is, of course, not often what we think of when we talk about genocide, right? And when people bring this accusation of genocide in the Old Testament, destroying the political people and that type of thing is not what you would classify as that. And I think this is also more in tune with what the Bible says, because the Bible says they were expunged from the land, right? The land vomited them up. Where's that on here? Vomited out its inhabitants, right? So the judgment of death is brought upon the people, like the kings and the priests and the people doing that, but not necessarily on your everyday farmer. While they did partake in these practices and they were vomited out of the land, they weren't necessarily, eradicated, right? And the same type of language is used, like this utterly destroyed, is used when we talk about Israel, right? So, if you, that there be sure that today you will certainly perish if you don't. So this is talking about if you don't follow the laws of God, the Israelites will certainly perish, right? And then later on, that's in Deuteronomy, and then in Jeremiah, they will be completely destroyed. Therefore, the Lord's army says, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all your families of the, talking about Nebuchadnezzar coming and the surrounding nations, and I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and hissing, an everlasting place of ruins, right? It's kind of the same thing there. And then when you look at the history of Israel and what happened when they were taken into exile, they killed off the high priest, they killed off the king, they did all this stuff, but they took the normal people back with them to Babylon, right? So that's what I think that's kind of this thing when we talk about the conquest of Canaan, we think like, they just went in there and killed all the women, children, and everything like that, where that's not necessarily what's happening, right? Good? Connor, you have a question?
I'm assuming we'll get to this, or we have already gotten to it, but in spite of all these different explanations, we still have to deal with the fact that at times God very specifically said, go kill all the women and the children and the donkeys.
Well, this is just specifically with the conquest of Canaan, right. But when you deal with say the flood, right? Yeah. Everyone died. Yeah. There is no, everyone died, the women, the children, every animal that wasn't on the ark, the only people who survived was Noah and his family, right? So, and then if you go to Revelation, right, same thing there, right? In Revelation, God wipes out everyone, right, who isn't who has the, who isn't a part, or who has the mark of the beast, right? So, yes, this complete destruction only works for the conquest of Canaan, right? Don't get me wrong when I say, we're not reinterpreting the flood that wasn't worldwide and only killed certain people, right? That's not what's happening there, right? So, did I get your question right?
Yeah.
So, I think this is just kind of a lot of people struggle with, especially when you deal with the stuff of, they're completely destroyed, but then they show up later, right? That type of thing. But so I find when it comes to these other types of things, we have to talk about kind of the three different kind of aspects with that. And the first one is that God is slow to anger. I don't know why I picked this picture. You look up slow to anger, this is what popped up, and I just thought it was funny. So we have a turtle. So I actually find it really funny. Slow to anger in the Bible is the actual, if you take the phrase, it means I have a long nose, right? It's one of those weird idioms in Hebrew that it means slow to anger, but if a literal translation is I have a long nose. So I find that really funny. So of course we have in Second Peter, I am stumbling over my words. The Lord is not slow about his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not willing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. Right? So you see this in a lot of situations where God is very slow, or not slow, but he is slow to anger. He does not judge people immediately, but he gives them a period of time to change their ways, to come to repentance. So, of course, you have in the flood, right? My spirit will not remain with man forever because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. A lot of people think this means that's your lifespan, right? Which is not what it's talking about, right? I mean, the obvious example is if you look at Aaron, right, the first high priest, he lived 122 years, right? What this is talking about is this is the time period from when he said this statement to when the flood is happening, right? He is giving them 120 years from the time of, from when he said this to when the flood's going to happen, right? Where he will bring his judgment. So again, he is slow to anger, right? He gives people time to change their ways and to correct their things, right? You go to Canaan, right? We talk about the Canaanites, right? And their judgment. This is God talking to Abraham, and he says, then in the fourth, so this fourth generation is, he's talking about bringing people out of Egypt, right? And then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the wrongdoings of the Amorites is not yet complete, right? So he's giving them time to correct themselves. He's like, hey, you got to fix yourself, right? And if you don't, I will bring judgment. And we see that also with Israel, right? I think that's my next one. Yeah, you see that with Israel, right? This is the most blatant example because the Bible is written for the Israelites, but he's patient. However, you remain patient with them for many years. You admonish them by your spirit through your prophets, yet they would not listen. Therefore, you handed them over to the peoples of the land, right? So God gives people time before he enacts judgment, right? And there's also, he also, as you see here, he admonished them by your spirit through your prophets, right? Now, you can't say it for everything, right? Like, we don't know, right? Because the Bible doesn't necessarily tell you everything. But I would say there is a pattern throughout the Bible that God sends people, like in Nineveh. He's like, hey, I'm going to bring judgment. You need to change your ways. I don't think God is just like, it says this, and then he's like waiting, not telling them, right? I think that's a very common trend in the Bible, is like he sends people to give warnings. Yes?
I think the people who actually listened, like there might have been like a few people that listened that actually did get captured, was like everyone.
In which situation?
Like whenever God warns the people,
Well,
and then some of them listen.
Yes, there are a few. I mean, you have Rahab, right?
Yeah.
That's her name, right? And she was saved in that sense. And she, that's a blatant example. You have the Ninevites, right? But I don't think it's the common trend. You have, of course, the flood. I don't think they changed, right? Obviously they didn't, so they were wiped out. And in Israel, that obviously they didn't because, they were all drug off, right? And there are a few, was David in Daniel. I think Daniel was alive when he was drug off as a prisoner, right?
Yeah, and 3 friends.
Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So yes, there is people like that would be brought up kind of in the turmoil of that type of thing. So God gives them provisions for safety and stuff like that, right? Those people were saved in different ways, right? So there will be people that are like that, but it's definitely not the common trend, right? It's rare.
Like a few people.
Yeah.
Like 1 or 2 people were like, oh yeah, we're gonna listen.
Yeah. I mean, all of Jericho was destroyed, but Rahab wasn't, right? And she was a part of that. And then, God, of course, then blesses her by putting her in the line of Jesus. That's pretty crazy and cool. But yeah, so God is, of course, slow to anger, right? And I think we also have to deal with the fact that also these people were horrible, right? The stuff that these people would do was terribly wicked, right? Of course, you have in the Bible. So if you don't know what this is Moloch. This is the god of the Canaanites. And what they do, you see, he's on fire, right? They'd have a fire under him, and he's a bronze statue, so it's metal, so he would entirely heat up, right? And they would put the baby on the hands of Moloch, and it would basically instantly die, because this is they'd get this. And that's how they would sacrifice children, right? This is what the Canaanites were doing, right? So you deal with this. Of course, you have the flood. The Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth. Oh, I missed that footnote. Sorry. Wickedness on the great on the earth, and every intent of his thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. I'm apparently struggling to speak today. But you have this with the flood, right? You know, this is actually condemning the entirety of the world at the time, right? Besides Noah and his family, right? They're entirely wicked, right? We don't know what they were doing, right? But God says they were wicked, and, you know, that's what we have to take it at, right? These were horrible people. You have Sodom and Gomorrah, where you have Moses. This is wrong. Okay, I'm confused. This is not correct. This is not the right verse. Leviticus. Okay. Oh, this is for Canaan. Okay. I'm sorry. This does not exist. Don't pay attention to this. So if you remember, I'm just going to go off of the fly here. Okay, so if you remember, God comes to Abraham, right? And he's talking with him. And Abraham says, if there's 20, I think it's if there's 20 people in Sodom and Gomorrah, will you spare it? And God says, yes. Is there 10 people? Will you spare the city? Yes. And then he keeps breaking the number down and down and down. But there wasn't any, right? The only righteous person there was Lot, right? And so you have basically, you know, these people were terrible, right? With Sodom and Gomorrah, they were judged in that way. But there's no righteous person there found, right? Okay, so... and then we have the Canaanites, and I think we have, so yeah, of course, you shall not, so basically at Leviticus, right, so a lot of scholars believe when they start doing the laws, right, you know, they talk about in the laws what you shall and shall not do. It starts with this: you shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor what was done in the lands of Canaan where I am bringing you, right? So, you know, you have a lot of these laws. So a lot of scholars believe the laws that God places are often things that the Canaanites were doing in themselves, right? You know, sexual immorality. They're obviously a big thing in Leviticus is don't kill your kids, right? And that's what the Canaanites were doing, right? So we don't have much time left, but of course these people were wicked. And if you want to know something funny, so the Canaanites became the Phoenicians, right? Same people group, right? Different name. The Phoenicians exported their culture to Carthage, so that was Rome's ancient enemy, right? So Carthaginians are Canaanites, right? And they, again, kept the practices of sacrificing a lot of children. So, you know, Hannibal and stuff like that, Scipio Africanus goes to Carthage, and then they eventually win and take over Carthage, right? And when they get to Carthage, they are actually the pagan Romans, right? This is even before Augustine, right? They take over Carthage, and they are disgusted. Like, pagan Rome is disgusted by the amount of child sacrifices that they are doing, right? So I guess that's like your third fun fact of the day. But yeah, they were so bad that even pagans were looking at these people like, you are terrible, right? And eventually leading on to them, why one of the reasons, I mean, again, it was a political reason, but one of the reasons that Rome completely wiped Carthage off the map, where they literally did kill everyone, was because they were that was one of their justifications. Like, these people sacrifice kids, right? They're horrible, right? So yeah, we have run out of time. Did it make sense? Any questions? Did I talk too fast? Yes. Okay, Dad says I talk too fast. Cool. Well, thank you for coming. I think next week we're going to hopefully finish up genocide. If you have any questions about genocide or things like that in the Bible, let me know. I'll try to answer them in a fast manner. So, thank you for coming. I hope I made sense.
It's a great topic considering